30 of the most elite financial specialists on the East Coast had spent 3 sleepless nights bleeding through spreadsheets, algorithms, and encrypted ledgers trying to find where millions were vanishing from the Chappelle empire. 30 brilliant minds flown in from New York, D.C., and Silicon Valley, armed with software that could crack international banking systems, and not a single one could trace the pattern. The 42nd floor conference room at Chappelle Industries had become a graveyard of failed theories. Crumpled yellow legal pads, abandoned Starbucks cups gone cold, and egos shattered against the glass walls overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Then, at 2:14 a.m., a cleaning lady pushed her cart through the doorway to mop the floor. Deborah Burnside was nobody. A 40-something woman with brown hair pulled back tight, wearing a faded uniform with her name barely visible on the pocket. No degree. No title. No voice in rooms like this. She'd spent 20 years working night shifts after dropping out of community college when rent and life crushed her dreams into dust. She worked in buildings where powerful people made decisions, but she was invisible. The kind of person men in $1,000 suits looked right through without ever seeing a face. But when her eyes drifted across the financial summary still glowing on the massive screen behind the conference table, something clicked. In exactly 10 seconds, while wiping down a table with one hand, she grabbed a pen from an abandoned notepad and circled 3 figures on the projection. 3 numbers that told the whole story. She had no idea that seated at the head of the table in perfect stillness, watching her every move with eyes like black ice, was Juan Chappelle himself, the king, the most ruthless and feared underground power broker in the city. A man who had destroyed more lives than she had ever known. A man whose silence could empty a room faster than a gunshot. Before we dive deeper into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from tonight. If this story grabs you, hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a powerful underdog tale. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that reminds you intelligence doesn't ask for permission. Now, let's find out what happens when the most dangerous man on the East Coast realizes the woman everyone overlooked just exposed what 30 specialists couldn't see. Juan Chappelle rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, his movements cutting through the chaos of voices like a blade. Every argument died instantly. "What are you doing?" His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was cold, controlled, and sharp enough to stop a heartbeat. Deborah froze, her cleaning rag still in one hand, the pen in the other. Her pulse hammered against her ribs as she turned slowly to face him. She'd cleaned this floor for 2 years and had never once been spoken to directly by anyone above middle management. Now Juan Chappelle was staring at her like she'd just walked into a room she had no right to enter. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back instinctively. "I thought the room was empty. I was just cleaning." Juan didn't move. His gaze dropped to the circled numbers on the screen, then back to her face. "What did you write?" Deborah swallowed hard. She knew she'd crossed a line. In a world like this, touching something that didn't belong to you could mean more than losing your job. She forced a shaky smile, trying to diffuse the tension. "I noticed something strange in the numbers. I know it's not my place. I clean floors, not spreadsheets. But when I see something messy, I can't help myself. Even if it's just dirty data." The room went deathly silent. For the first time in years, Juan Chappelle had no immediate response. He studied her, not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, curiosity. One of the specialists, a man in a wrinkled Oxford shirt, laughed nervously. "Sir, she's a janitor. She doesn't know what she's looking at." Juan raised one hand. The laughter stopped. He stepped closer to Deborah, his polished shoes silent against the floor, his shadow swallowing her smaller frame. "Explain what you saw," he said quietly, "and make it clear." Deborah's throat tightened. She could walk away. Apologize. vanish back into the invisibility that had kept her safe her entire life. But something in his eyes told her this moment wouldn't come again. She straightened her shoulders, pointed to the circled numbers, and began to speak. But to understand how a woman holding a mop could see what 30 specialists missed, you need to understand who Deborah Burnside really was, and why the world had trained itself not to see her coming. But to understand how a woman holding a mop could see what 30 specialists missed, you need to understand who Deborah Burnside really was, and why the world had trained itself not to see her coming. 23 years earlier, Deborah sat in the back row of Introduction to Accounting at Hudson County Community College, her second-hand textbook covered in highlighter marks and sticky notes. She was 19 years old, working the overnight shift at a 24-hour diner, and running on 3 hours of sleep. While other students complained about the workload, Deborah absorbed it like oxygen. Balance sheets made sense to her in a way that most things in life didn't. Numbers didn't lie. They didn't make promises they couldn't keep. They just told you the truth if you knew how to read them. Her professor, a retired CPA named Mr. Castellano, pulled her aside after class one afternoon. "You have a gift for this," he told her, tapping her latest exam, a perfect score. "You see patterns most accountants take years to recognize." Deborah had smiled, exhausted but hopeful. "I just like things to add up." "Then keep going," he'd said. "This could take you somewhere." She believed him. For exactly 7 more weeks. That's when her mother's diabetes spiraled into kidney failure. When the medical bills started arriving in envelopes so thick they felt like threats. When Deborah's 2 part-time jobs became 4, and her class schedule became impossible to maintain. She dropped out 3 weeks before finals. No ceremony. No explanation to her professors. She just stopped showing up. Mr. Castellano called her once. She didn't answer. What was she supposed to say? That dreams don't pay for dialysis? The years that followed blurred together into a cycle of survival. She worked as a waitress at diners that smelled like burnt coffee and grease. She restocked shelves at a grocery store where the fluorescent lights buzzed like trapped insects. She cleaned office buildings, hospitals, and eventually high-rise corporate towers in Manhattan where the carpets cost more than her annual salary. Deborah learned to be invisible. It wasn't hard. When you wore a uniform and carried a mop, people looked past you like you were part of the furniture. Executives held confidential phone calls in hallways while she emptied trash cans 5 feet away. Lawyers left contracts open on desks while she dusted around them. Nobody thought twice. But Deborah never stopped noticing. She noticed when the inventory logs at the grocery store didn't match the stockroom counts. She mentioned it to the manager once, casually, while restocking cereal, and he'd discovered an employee skimming products for months. She noticed when the hospital's weekend staffing schedules created dangerous gaps in coverage. She left a note for the charge nurse, and signed, and watched the shifts get quietly reorganized within a week. She noticed when the law firm she cleaned for was paying for cloud storage services from 3 different vendors, all charging them separately for the same redundant backups. She almost said something. Then she remembered what happened to people who spoke up when they weren't supposed to. So she kept her mouth shut and mopped the floors. Mess is mess, she told herself, whether it's dirt or data. But data wasn't her job. Keeping her head down was. By the time Deborah turned 42, she'd been cleaning the Chappelle Industries building for 2 years. It was the best-paying night shift she'd ever had, which meant she could finally drop down to 2 jobs instead of 3. Her mother had passed 4 years earlier. The medical debt was still there, a weight she carried quietly, paying it down $20 at a time. She knew the building better than most people who worked there during the day. She knew which conference rooms were used for quarterly reviews and which ones stayed dark for months. She knew the CFO kept mints in his desk drawer and that the executive assistant on the 38th floor left her resignation letter in the printer one night and came back for it the next morning, eyes red. Deborah saw everything. She just never said anything. Until tonight. While the specialists in that 42nd floor conference room shouted over each other about offshore routing protocols and encrypted blockchain vulnerabilities, Deborah had been emptying trash cans near the door. They spoke in the language of expensive educations and even more expensive consulting firms. They name-dropped software platforms and regulatory frameworks. They treated complexity like proof of intelligence. Deborah had learned accounting in the back of a community college classroom with peeling linoleum floors. She'd practiced pattern recognition while counting inventory in freezing stockrooms at 4 a.m. She didn't know the jargon, but she knew what numbers were supposed to look like when they told the truth. And these numbers were lying. Not in a complicated way. In the simplest way possible. Same amounts. Same intervals. Same percentages bleeding out, disguised as operational inefficiency. It was a pattern. And patterns were the one thing Deborah Burnside had spent 20 years learning to see. The specialists had been searching for a sophisticated answer because sophisticated people always assumed the problem would match their intelligence. They looked for hidden complexity because simplicity felt beneath them. Deborah looked for what was actually there. That's the difference between intelligence and education. Education teaches you what to look for. Intelligence teaches you how to see. Now, standing in that conference room with 30 pairs of eyes locked on her and Juan Chappelle waiting for her to explain herself, Deborah felt the weight of every year she'd spent invisible. Every night shift. Every condescending dismissal. Every moment someone had looked through her like she didn't exist. She could still walk away. Apologize for overstepping. Go back to being nobody. But she'd seen the numbers. And the numbers didn't lie. Juan's voice cut through her thoughts, low and controlled. I'm waiting. Deborah took a breath and pointed to the circled figures on the screen. You're not being robbed, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You're being bled. Slowly. Deliberately. Same percentage, same timing every cycle. It's not hidden in complexity. It's hidden in repetition. Whoever's doing this made it look like operational waste so nobody would question it. She glanced at the specialists, their exhausted faces now frozen in disbelief. They weren't looking for simple, she continued. They were looking for smart. But sometimes the smartest theft is the boring one. The room was silent. Juan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to the lead specialist, a man in his 50s with silver hair and a wrinkled Armani suit. Verify it, Juan said quietly. The specialist's face went pale. Sir, I don't think. Verify it. It took less than 4 minutes. When the specialist looked up from his laptop, his voice was barely a whisper. She's right. Juan Chappelle didn't smile. Didn't react. He just stood there, staring at the woman holding a mop who'd just done what 30 experts couldn't. Then he did something Deborah had never seen him do in 2 years of cleaning his building. He pulled out a chair at the conference table and nodded toward it. Sit down, he said. We're not finished. Deborah didn't sit. She stood there, cleaning rag still clutched in one hand, staring at the empty chair like it might explode if she touched it. Juan's eyes narrowed slightly. That wasn't a suggestion. She sat. Slowly. The leather felt foreign beneath her. Too smooth, too expensive. She'd cleaned these chairs 100 times but never imagined sitting in one. Juan turned to face the room. 30 specialists, all of them standing now, watching the scene unfold with expressions ranging from confusion to outright hostility. Nobody leaves, Juan said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of disbelief. Not until we understand exactly what we missed. The lead specialist, The silver-haired man in the wrinkled Armani stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Sir, with all due respect, we've been working around the clock on this. We've analyzed every transaction, every account, every—" "And you found nothing," one interrupted, his tone flat. "She found it in 10 seconds. A younger specialist, mid-30s with dark-rimmed glasses and a Yale hoodie, laughed, sharp and bitter. Come on. She got lucky. She saw a coincidence and called it a pattern." One's head turned slowly toward him. The laughter died instantly. "Lucky," one repeated, the word landing like a stone in still water. He looked back at Deborah. "Explain it again. In detail. So everyone here understands what luck looks like." Deborah's throat tightened. Every eye in the room was on her now. Some curious, most skeptical, a few openly hostile. These were people who'd spent decades building careers on their intelligence. She was about to tell them they'd missed the obvious. She stood, walked to the screen, and pointed to the first circled number. "This is a logistics payment," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Routing fees for offshore transfers, right?" The lead specialist nodded reluctantly. "Correct. Every 2 weeks, the same amount gets deducted. Always 2.3% of the transfer total. Always on a Thursday. Always between 11 p.m. and midnight. Standard processing fees." Another specialist interjected. "That's normal for international." "It's normal," Deborah agreed, cutting him off gently. "That's the problem. It's so normal nobody questioned it." She pointed to the second number. "This one's listed as operational overhead. Administrative costs for managing the transaction pipeline. Another 2.3%. Also every 2 weeks. Also on Thursdays. Also between 11 p.m. and midnight." The room was quieter now. A few specialists exchanged glances. Deborah moved to the third circled figure. "And this one's buried under compliance consulting. Regulatory fees for transaction monitoring. Same percentage. Same day. Same time window." She turned to face them. 3 separate line items. 3 different vendor names. All pulling the exact same percentage at the exact same interval. It's not sophisticated. It's just disciplined. The Yale specialist shook his head. "That's not proof. Lots of vendors bill on regular cycles." "Not with identical percentages," Deborah said, her voice firm now. "And not from accounts that don't exist." The room went dead silent. Juan leaned forward slightly. "Explain." Deborah pointed back at the screen. "I saw the vendor registration codes next to each charge. 2 of them are formatted wrong. They don't match the standard alphanumeric pattern your system uses. Someone created fake entries and made them look legitimate by spacing them out and keeping the amounts predictable." She looked directly at the lead specialist. "You were searching for a breach. A hack. Something complex. But this isn't theft. It's laundering disguised as operating costs. Whoever's doing this has internal access. They know your systems well enough to make it look boring." The silver-haired specialist's face drained of color. He turned to his laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. 2 others crowded behind him, watching the screen over his shoulder. 30 seconds passed. Then a minute. Finally, the lead specialist looked up, his voice hollow. "The vendor IDs are fake." "She's right." Another specialist pulled up a separate ledger on her tablet, scrolling frantically. "The routing patterns match. Identical timestamps across all 3 charges." A third specialist, older with deep lines around his eyes, just closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "We ran algorithmic scans for anomalies. This wasn't anomalous. It was normalized. The Yale specialist's hands were shaking. We looked for deviation from pattern. This was the pattern. Juan said nothing. He just watched them unravel, piece by piece, as the reality settled in. They hadn't missed something complicated. They'd missed something simple because they'd assumed simple wasn't worth looking for. The silence in the room was suffocating. No one spoke. No one moved. 30 of the brightest financial minds money could buy, sitting in the ruins of their credibility. Deborah stood by the screen, her pulse still racing, unsure if she should sit back down or run for the door. Juan rose from his chair, slow and deliberate. He walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the Manhattan skyline. The city lights glittered in the darkness, indifferent and vast. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a verdict. I brought 30 people into this room, paid them a combined $7 million over 3 days, gave them every resource they asked for, every tool, every access point. He turned to face them. And not one of you thought to look for the simple answer. The lead specialist opened his mouth to respond, but Juan raised a hand. You didn't fail because you're not smart, Juan continued, his tone colder now. You failed because you were too proud to consider that the answer might not require your intelligence. You looked for problems worthy of your degrees. She looked for the truth. He glanced at Deborah just briefly, then back at the room. Everyone here is paid to think, he said. She's the only one who actually did. The words landed like a gavel. No one argued. No one defended themselves. The humiliation wasn't loud. It was absolute. Juan walked back to the head of the table and placed both hands flat against the surface. You're all dismissed, he said quietly. Send your final reports by Monday, and bill half your quoted rate. The Yale specialist's eyes went wide. Sir. Half, Juan repeated. You're lucky I'm paying you at all. The specialists began gathering their things in silence. Laptops, legal pads, jackets. Some avoided eye contact. Others looked at Deborah with something between resentment and disbelief. Within 3 minutes, the room was nearly empty. The lead specialist paused at the door, his hand on the frame. He looked back at Deborah, his expression unreadable. You should have been in the room from the start, he said quietly. Then he left. The door clicked shut. And just like that, it was only the two of them. Juan Chappelle and Deborah Burnside. The most powerful man on the East Coast and the woman no one was supposed to see. Juan sat back down, his gaze steady and unblinking. Now, he said, his voice softer but no less dangerous. Let's talk about what happens next. Juan didn't move from his seat. He just watched her, the way a predator watches movement in tall grass. Patient, calculating, already 10 steps ahead. Deborah stood frozen by the screen, her cleaning rag still balled up in her fist like some kind of absurd security blanket. The conference room felt different now that it was empty. Bigger. Colder. The city lights beyond the glass seemed impossibly far away. Sit, one said again. This time, Deborah didn't hesitate. She crossed the room and lowered herself into the chair directly across from him. The table between them felt like a negotiating line neither of them had agreed to yet. Juan leaned back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. For a long moment, he said nothing. Just studied her the way someone might study a puzzle they hadn't expected to find. How long have you been cleaning this building? He finally asked. 2 years. 3 months. And before that, Deborah hesitated. Different buildings. Offices. Hospitals. A hotel in Midtown for a while. How long total? 20 years. Give or take. Juan's expression didn't change. You dropped out of college. It wasn't a question. Deborah's stomach tightened. He'd already looked into her. Of course he had. Community college, she corrected quietly. Accounting program. I made it 1.5 years. Why'd you stop? My mother got sick. Medical bills. I needed to work. She's still alive? No. She passed 4 years ago. Juan nodded slowly, as if filing that information away. You went back to school after? No. Why not? Deborah met his gaze, her jaw tight. Because by then I had $20,000 in medical debt and rent I could barely cover. You don't go back to school when you're drowning. You just try not to drown faster. For the first time, something shifted in Juan's expression. Not sympathy. He didn't deal in sympathy. But recognition. He understood survival. You could have lied tonight, he said, his tone measured. Stayed quiet. Let them keep searching. Collected your paycheck and gone home. I know. So why didn't you? Deborah looked down at her hands, still rough and red from years of chemical cleaners and scalding water. Because I saw the answer. And I couldn't unsee it. Juan tilted his head slightly. That's not a reason. That's an excuse. Try again. She looked up, her voice firmer now. Because staying quiet when you know the truth makes you part of the problem. And I've spent 20 years being invisible. I'm tired of pretending I don't see things. Juan's eyes narrowed, not in anger but in evaluation. He was testing her. Not her intelligence. Her honesty. You know what I do, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. But Deborah answered anyway. I know what people say you do. And what do they say? That you run an empire built on things that don't show up on legal paperwork. That you're dangerous. That people who cross you disappear. Juan didn't blink. And you still spoke up tonight. I didn't think you'd kill me for circling numbers on a screen. You didn't think, Juan said slowly, or you didn't care? Deborah held his gaze. I thought the worst you'd do was fire me. And I've been fired before. A faint smile ghosted across Juan's face, so brief she almost missed it. You're either very brave or very stupid. Probably both. The smile vanished. Juan leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his voice dropping lower. Let me tell you how this works in my world, Deborah. Intelligence is a currency, but it's also a target. The moment you prove you can see what others can't, you become valuable. And valuable things get used. Or they get eliminated. There's no middle ground. Deborah's pulse quickened, but she didn't look away. I don't make offers, Juan continued. I don't negotiate. I don't give second chances. If I bring someone into my operation, it's because I've decided they're worth the risk. And if they prove me wrong, if they betray me, lie to me, or become a liability, they don't get a warning. They just stop being a problem. He let the words hang in the air. I'm telling you this because you need to understand what you walked into tonight. You think you exposed a financial leak. What you actually did was prove you can see things my own people missed. That makes you useful. It also makes you dangerous. Deborah's throat felt tight, but she forced herself to speak. Dangerous to who? To the people who don't want to be seen, Juan said simply. The person behind that laundering scheme knows they've been exposed. They don't know how. But they'll figure it out. And when they do, they'll want to know who you are and whether you saw anything else. The weight of his words settled over her like a lead blanket. So what happens now? She asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Juan leaned back again, his expression unreadable. That depends on you. On me. I can make you invisible again, he said. Pay you for tonight. set you up somewhere else. A different building. A different city if you want. You walk away and this never happened. Deborah stared at him. Or you stay. You work for me. Not as a janitor. As someone who sees what others don't. I pay you more than you've ever made in your life. I protect you. And you help me make sure nothing like this happens again. It sounded too simple. Too clean. And if I'm wrong later? Deborah asked, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. If I make a mistake or miss something, do I disappear? Juan didn't hesitate. Only if you lie to me. The answer was calm. Honest. Terrifying. I don't punish mistakes, he continued. I punish betrayal. You can be wrong. You can't be dishonest. If you tell me the truth, even if it's a truth I don't want to hear, you stay alive. But if you lie, if you hide things, if you try to play games with me. He paused, his gaze like stone. Then yes. You disappear. Deborah felt her breath catch. This wasn't a job offer. It was a contract written in blood. Why me? She asked. You could find someone else. Someone with credentials. Someone who actually belongs in your world. I have people with credentials, Juan said flatly. 30 of them just left this room. You know what they don't have? The ability to see past their own egos. You're not clouded by what you think you should find. You just look for what's actually there. He stood, walking slowly to the window, his silhouette sharp against the city lights. I don't trust easily, Deborah. But I trust patterns. And you've just shown me you can see them better than anyone I've paid millions to find. He turned back to face her. So decide. Walk away and stay safe. Or stay and step into something you can't walk back from. Deborah sat there, her mind racing. She thought about her apartment. Her debt. Her invisible life. The 20 years she'd spent watching other people make decisions while she scrubbed their floors. She thought about the fear in Juan's voice when he said only if you lie. The honesty in it. The code. And she thought about what it felt like to finally be seen. Slowly, Deborah stood. She walked to the chair directly across from Juan's seat at the head of the table. And she sat down. I'm staying, she said quietly. But I need you to promise me one thing. Juan's eyebrow raised slightly. I don't make promises. Then make an exception. His eyes narrowed. What do you want? If I ever become a liability, she said, her voice firm now, you tell me to my face before anything happens. I don't want to disappear wondering why. For a long moment Juan said nothing. Then, slowly, he nodded. Deal. The first thing Deborah learned about Juan Chappelle's operation was that it didn't look like a criminal empire. It looked like a Fortune 500 company. 3 days after the conference room confrontation, she walked into Chappelle Industries at 9 a.m., not 2 a.m., wearing clothes that didn't smell like industrial cleaner. Juan had sent a car. Sent an advance on her first paycheck. Sent a message through his assistant that she'd have an office on the 40th floor by the end of the week. No contract. No formal title. Just a desk access, and the unspoken understanding that she now belonged to something she couldn't fully see yet. The 40th floor was different from the boardroom she'd cleaned. Quieter. More controlled. Glass offices lined the perimeter, each one offering a view of Manhattan that made her old apartment feel like it existed on a different planet. In the center, an open floor plan housed analysts, coordinators, and accountants. All of them moving with the precision of people who understood that mistakes here carried consequences. Juan's corner office sat at the far end, doors closed, blinds half drawn. Deborah was assigned a workstation near the financial operations team. No introductions. No orientations. Just a laptop, login credentials, and a stack of ledgers that needed reviewing. She dove in. Within 2 hours, she'd found 3 more inefficiencies. Not theft this time. Just waste. Redundant software subscriptions charging different departments for identical services. Vendor contracts that hadn't been renegotiated in 5 years despite market rate drops. Payroll processing fees that were triple what they should have been. Small things. Boring things. The kind of things people missed because they weren't dramatic enough to notice. Deborah made notes. Highlighted the patterns. Built a quiet case in a spreadsheet that anyone could verify. By lunch, she'd saved the operation $43,000 annually. Nobody said thank you. The hostility started small. A woman in her early 30s, blonde, sharp-featured, designer blazer, walked past Deborah's desk and paused, her eyes flicking over the second-hand blouse Deborah had bought at a thrift store in Queens. "You're the janitor," she said. Not a question. An accusation. Deborah looked up. "I was." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "And now you're—" "What exactly?" "I work here." "Doing whatever needs to be done." The blonde woman leaned against the edge of Deborah's desk, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt louder than shouting. "Let me give you some advice. People here have spent years earning their positions. They've proven themselves. You stumbled into a lucky moment, and now you're acting like you belong. That's not going to end well for you." Deborah met her gaze evenly. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job," the woman repeated, her tone laced with contempt. "You don't even know what that is yet." She straightened and walked away, heels clicking against the polished floor. Deborah exhaled slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she returned to her spreadsheet. Welcome to the empire. By the end of the first week, Deborah had identified the key players. There was Marcus Hayes, the chief financial officer. Mid-50s, gray beard, tailored suits that probably cost more than Deborah's annual rent. He ran the financial operations with military precision, and his team revered him. He hadn't spoken to Deborah directly, but she'd caught him watching her twice from across the floor, his expression unreadable. Then there was Victor Kane, the logistics overseer. Victor was the one who made Deborah's instincts scream. He was younger than Marcus, early 40s, athletic build, dark hair slicked back, always wearing expensive watches that caught the light when he gestured. He oversaw the supply chain operations, the routing systems, the vendor relationships that kept the empire's legitimate businesses running smoothly. He smiled easily, spoke smoothly, moved through the office like someone who knew exactly how valuable he was. And he hated Deborah on sight. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened when Juan mentioned her findings in a morning briefing. In the way he interrupted her twice when she tried to explain a discrepancy in the logistics billing. In the way he called her the cleaning lady in front of his team, then laughed like it was a joke. Victor had been with Juan for 8 years. He'd built the routing infrastructure from the ground up. He was trusted, respected, untouchable. Until Deborah walked in and proved that trust could miss things. There were others too. Silent enforcers who didn't work in the offices but passed through occasionally. Men in dark suits who didn't carry laptops, whose eyes scanned rooms like security cameras. They didn't speak to Deborah, but they noticed her. She could feel their attention, sharp and assessing, every time they walked past. One of them, a man with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stopped at her desk on Friday afternoon. "You're Burnside," he said. Not a question. "Yes." He nodded once, his gaze cold and professional. "Mr. Chappelle wants you careful. Don't work late alone. Don't take the subway after dark. If something feels wrong, it probably is." Deborah's pulse quickened. "Is there a specific threat?" The man almost smiled. "There's always a specific threat. You just don't know which one yet." He walked away before she could respond. That night, Deborah stayed late anyway. Not because she was reckless, because she was thorough. There were 3 more accounts she wanted to cross-reference before the weekend. Patterns she needed to track across quarterly reports. The office had emptied by 7 p.m. Only the security lights remained, casting long shadows across the rows of desks. Deborah was deep in a spreadsheet when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Coming from the far side of the floor. She looked up, her heart rate spiking. Victor Kane stood 20 feet away, leaning against a support column, arms crossed. He'd been there long enough to be comfortable. Long enough to have been watching. "Working late," he said, his voice friendly in a way that made Deborah's skin crawl. "That's dedication." "Just finishing something," Deborah replied, keeping her tone neutral. Victor pushed off the column and walked closer. His hands in his pockets, his smile easy. "You know, I've been thinking about what you found. That laundering scheme. Pretty clever to spot it so fast." "It wasn't that complicated." "No," Victor agreed. "It wasn't. Which makes me wonder why 30 specialists missed it." He stopped at the edge of her desk, looking down at her screen. "Maybe they weren't looking in the right places," Deborah said carefully. "Or maybe," Victor said slowly, "they were told not to look too closely at certain accounts." The air between them shifted. Deborah's hands stilled on the keyboard. "I wouldn't know anything about that." "Of course not." Victor's smile widened, but his eyes stayed cold. "You're new. You don't know how things work yet. Who to trust. Who to leave alone." He tapped the edge of her desk twice, a casual gesture that felt like a warning. "Just be careful, Deborah. Intelligence is valuable here. But so is discretion. Sometimes knowing when not to see something is just as important as seeing it in the first place." He walked away, his footsteps echoing across the empty floor. Deborah sat frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing. The real danger isn't Juan, she realized. It's the people who are threatened by what I can see. She stayed another hour, but she couldn't focus. Every shadow felt like movement. Every distant sound felt like footsteps. When she finally packed up and headed for the elevator, she glanced back at the dark office. Somewhere in the rows of glass and steel, someone was watching. She could feel it. And she had no idea who. Over the next 3 weeks, Deborah became a problem that Victor Kane couldn't ignore. Not because she was loud. Not because she overstepped. But because every time she touched something it got better. The redundant software contracts? Cancelled and consolidated. Annual savings. $127,000. The inflated vendor pricing? Renegotiated. Monthly savings. $34,000. The routing inefficiencies in the logistics chain? Streamlined. Quarterly savings. $220,000. Deborah didn't make speeches about her findings. She just sent clean, documented reports to Juan with the numbers highlighted and the solutions outlined. No ego. No drama. Just results. And the bleeding stopped. For the first time in 18 months, the financial reports showed consistent growth instead of mysterious erosion. The operations that had been hemorrhaging money quietly were suddenly running lean and profitable. Juan noticed. So did everyone else. The morning briefing on a cold Tuesday in November was when the shift became undeniable. Marcus Hayes stood at the front of the conference room, presenting the quarterly projections on the screen behind him. Juan sat at the head of the table, his expression neutral, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Deborah sat 3 seats down, her notebook open, her pen still. "Revenue is up 11% from last quarter," Marcus announced, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man delivering good news. Operational costs are down 8%. We're tracking ahead of forecast for the first time in 2 years. Why? Juan asked quietly. Marcus paused. Several factors. Market conditions improved slightly, and we've tightened our. Burnside, Juan interrupted, his gaze shifting to Deborah. What did you fix? Every head in the room turned. Deborah cleared her throat. Vendor consolidation. Contract renegotiations. Some routing adjustments in the supply chain. Nothing major. Nothing major, Juan repeated, his tone flat. And yet we're suddenly 8% leaner. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he recovered quickly. Ms. Burnside's contributions have been valuable. Valuable, Juan echoed. He looked around the room, his eyes landing on each person in turn. We've had financial analysts, efficiency consultants, and operations managers on payroll for years. And we needed a former janitor to show us where the money was going. No one spoke. Juan leaned back in his chair. If anyone else in this room finds an inefficiency Burnside missed, bring it to me. Otherwise, assume she's seeing things you're not. The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had changed. Deborah could feel the resentment radiating from certain seats like heat from a furnace. Victor Kane sat across from her, his expression pleasant, his hands folded calmly on the table. But his eyes were sharp as broken glass. The first attempt to discredit her came 3 days later. Deborah arrived at her desk Friday morning to find an email from Marcus Hayes waiting in her inbox. Subject line, urgent. Discrepancy in logistics report. She opened it, her stomach tightening. Deborah, I've been reviewing your analysis of the routing costs from last month, and I'm seeing some figures that don't align with our internal audits. Specifically, the savings projections you outlined appear to be overstated by approximately 40%. I need you to recheck your numbers and provide documentation for your calculations by end of business today. This is time sensitive, as Mr. Chappelle is using your report for strategic planning. Regards, Marcus Hayes. Deborah read it twice, her pulse quickening. Overstated by 40%. That wasn't possible. She'd triple-checked every figure, cross-referenced every account. The math was airtight. She pulled up her original spreadsheet, her hands moving quickly across the keyboard, retracing every calculation. The numbers were correct. She cross-checked against the internal audit files Marcus referenced. The numbers matched. So why was Marcus saying they didn't? Deborah opened the audit files attached to his email and scrolled through them slowly, her eyes narrowing. And then she saw it. Someone had altered the baseline figures in the audit. Not dramatically. Just enough to make her projections look inflated. The changes were subtle, shifting a few decimal points, reclassifying certain expenses to make the savings appear exaggerated. It was clean, professional, almost invisible. But Deborah had spent 20 years noticing what others missed. She pulled the original audit files from the server archive and compared them side by side. The tampering was there. Time-stamped. Traceable. Someone had edited the files after she'd submitted her report. Deborah stood from her desk, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. This wasn't a mistake. This was sabotage. She grabbed her laptop and walked directly to Juan's office. His assistant, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s named Claire, looked up from her desk. "He's in a call," Claire said. "You'll need to." "Tell him I need 5 minutes," Deborah interrupted, her voice firm. "It's urgent." Claire studied her for a moment, then picked up the phone. She spoke quietly, then nodded. "Go in." Deborah pushed through the door. Juan sat behind his desk, phone pressed to his ear, his expression unreadable. He held up one finger, wait, and finished his conversation in clipped, efficient sentences. When he hung up, He looked at Deborah. This better be worth interrupting. Deborah set her laptop on his desk, turning it so he could see the screen. Someone altered the audit files to make my report look wrong. Marcus sent me an email this morning claiming my numbers are overstated. They're not. But someone changed the baseline data to make it look that way. Juan leaned forward, his eyes scanning the side-by-side comparison. When were the files edited? He asked. Yesterday. 11:47 p.m. After business hours. Who has access to those files? Marcus. Victor. The senior operations team. Deborah paused. And IT, obviously. Juan's jaw tightened slightly. He pulled the laptop closer, scrolling through the documents himself, his movements methodical. After a long silence, he looked up. You think Marcus is behind this? I don't know, Deborah said honestly. But someone wants you to doubt my work. And they're doing it carefully enough that most people wouldn't catch it. Juan stared at her, his expression giving nothing away. Do you want to leave? He asked quietly. Deborah blinked. What? This is what I warned you about, Juan said, his tone calm but cold. You're valuable. That makes you a target. If you walk away now, I'll protect you. Set you up somewhere safe. But if you stay, this gets worse before it gets better. Deborah's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. I'm not leaving because someone's scared of what I see. Juan studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. Go back to your desk. Say nothing about this. I'll handle it. How? By watching, Juan said simply. People who panic make mistakes. And I want to see who panics next. Deborah returned to her desk, her stomach in knots. She tried to focus on her work, but every sound made her jump. Every email notification felt like a threat. At 4:37 p.m., her screen flickered. A system notification appeared. File access denied. She frowned and tried to open the logistics database. Locked. She tried the vendor contracts folder. Locked. Her archived reports. Locked. Someone had revoked her access to everything. Deborah's breath caught. She grabbed her phone and texted Claire. All my files just got locked out. Did Juan authorize this? The response came back in seconds. No. Checking now. 5 minutes later, Claire appeared at her desk, her face tight. IT says the lockout was triggered by a security protocol. Flagged for suspicious activity on your account. That's impossible, Deborah said. I haven't done anything. I know, Claire interrupted. Juan knows too. He's pulling the access logs now. Deborah sank back in her chair, her heart pounding. This wasn't just discrediting her anymore. This was erasing her. At 6:15 p.m., Juan's office door opened. Victor Kane walked out, his expression calm, his hands in his pockets. He glanced at Deborah as he passed her desk. And he smiled. Deborah noticed the car on Thursday. Black sedan. Tinted windows. Parked across the street from her apartment building in Queens when she left for work at 7:30 a.m. Still there when she came home at 8:45 p.m. Different car on Friday. Same position. Same tinted windows. By Saturday, she stopped pretending it was paranoia. She was being followed. The subway ride to work Monday morning felt different. Every person standing too close felt like a threat. Every set of eyes that lingered too long made her pulse spike. She'd taken the same route for 2 years as a janitor and never once felt unsafe. Now she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always 3 steps behind her. When she emerged from the station near Chappelle Industries, she spotted him immediately. A man in a gray jacket leaning against a newspaper stand, phone in hand, not reading anything. Just watching. Deborah kept walking, her pace steady, her breathing controlled. The man followed. Not close enough to be obvious. Just close enough to be felt. She made it to the building entrance, badged through security, and rode the elevator to the 40th floor. Her hands didn't stop shaking until she sat down at her desk. That night, she came home to find her apartment door slightly ajar. Not broken. Not forced. Just unlocked. As if she'd forgotten to close it completely. Except Deborah never forgot things like that. She stood in the hallway, her keys gripping between her fingers like a weapon, her heart hammering against her ribs. She pushed the door open slowly. Everything looked untouched. Her thrift store couch still sagging in the same spot. Her dishes still in the sink. Her bills still stacked on the counter. But someone had been inside. She could feel it in the air. A wrongness like the space had been violated in ways her eyes couldn't quite detect. Deborah checked the bathroom, the bedroom, the closet. Nothing missing. Nothing broken. But on her kitchen table, centered perfectly, was a single folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. No words. Just a phone number. Handwritten. Anonymous. The message was clear. We know where you live. Deborah didn't call the police. What would she say? That she felt watched? That someone might have entered her apartment but took nothing? That she worked for a man whose empire existed in the gray spaces the law couldn't touch? Instead, she sat on her couch in the dark, staring at the paper, wondering if leaving would even make her safe anymore. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. The phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of the spiral. A text from an unknown number. Car downstairs. Black SUV. Get in. Deborah's breath caught. She moved to the window and looked down at the street. A black SUV idled at the curb, hazard lights blinking. She grabbed her jacket and went downstairs. The man with the scar through his eyebrow sat in the driver's seat. The same enforcer who'd warned her weeks ago to be careful. Get in, he said when she hesitated at the passenger door. Deborah climbed into the back seat. The doors locked automatically. Where are we going? Somewhere you can talk without someone listening through your walls. Deborah's stomach dropped. They bugged my apartment. The driver glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Not yet. But they've been inside. Twice. Who's they? That's what Mr. Chappelle is trying to figure out. They drove for 20 minutes, winding through neighborhoods Deborah didn't recognize, until they pulled into an underground parking garage beneath an unmarked building in Lower Manhattan. The driver led her through a service entrance, up 2 flights of stairs, and into a small, windowless office. Juan Chappelle sat behind a desk, a single desk lamp casting shadows across his face. Sit, he said, his voice calm. Deborah sat. The driver closed the door behind her and stood outside. For a long moment, Juan just looked at her, his expression unreadable. Someone broke into your apartment tonight, he said finally. They didn't take anything. Just left a number to make sure you knew they'd been there. How do you know that? Deborah asked, though she already suspected the answer. Because I've had people watching you since the day you started. Deborah's chest tightened. You've been following me? Protecting you, Juan corrected. There's a difference. Is there? Deborah's voice sharpened. Because right now it feels like I traded one kind of surveillance for another. Juan leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. You think I'm the problem? I think I was safer when I was invisible. You were never safe, Juan said quietly. You just didn't know you weren't. The moment you walked into that boardroom and circled those numbers, you became a target. I didn't make that happen. I'm just trying to keep you alive long enough to find out who did. Deborah's hands clenched in her lap. And what happens when you figure it out? Do I get to go back to my life? Juan's expression darkened. You don't have that life anymore. You can't unsee what you saw. You can't unknow what you know. The only question now is whether you survive what comes next. That's not an answer. It's the only answer there is. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Deborah stared at the man across from her, the man who'd given her opportunity, protection, and a cage she hadn't fully understood she was stepping into. Why are you doing this? She asked finally, her voice softer now. You could have just paid me off. Sent me away. Why bring me in? Why protect me? Juan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was lower, almost reflective. Because I haven't trusted anyone in years. Deborah blinked. What? Everyone around me wants something, Juan continued, his gaze distant. Power. Money. Protection. They smile and nod and say what I want to hear because they're afraid of what happens if they don't. I've built an empire surrounded by people who are too scared to tell me the truth. He looked at her directly now, his eyes sharp. And then you walked into that room. You had nothing to gain, everything to lose. And you still spoke up. Not because you were brave, because you couldn't help yourself. You saw the truth and you couldn't unsee it. His jaw tightened. That's the rarest thing in my world, Deborah. Not intelligence. Honesty. And I don't know if I can trust you yet. But I know I can't trust anyone else. The words landed like stones. Deborah realized with sudden stark clarity that Juan Chappelle wasn't protecting her out of kindness. He was protecting her because she was the only person in his empire who might actually tell him the truth when it mattered. And that made her both invaluable and desperately alone. I need to know something, Deborah said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. What? If I'm just a tool to you, something useful until I'm not, then tell me now. Because I can't do this if I'm just waiting for the day you decide I'm more dangerous than I'm worth. Juan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of something almost human. You're not a tool, he said quietly. You're a variable I haven't figured out yet. And that terrifies me more than any enemy I've ever faced. He stood, walking to the small window overlooking the parking garage below. I don't make promises, Deborah. You know that. But I'll tell you this. As long as you're honest with me, you're under my protection. Not because you're useful. Because you're rare. Deborah stood, her legs unsteady, her mind racing. And what about the people trying to scare me? The ones who broke into my apartment. They're making their move, Juan said, his voice cold now. Which means they're panicking. And panic creates mistakes. He turned to face her. Go back to work tomorrow. Act normal. Let them think you're rattled. I'll handle the rest. How? Juan's smile was thin and humorless. By giving them exactly what they want. A reason to come out of the shadows. Deborah walked out of that office knowing three things with absolute certainty. She was protected. She was trapped. And someone inside Juan's empire wanted her gone badly enough to risk everything to make it happen. Juan called the meeting for 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. No warning. No agenda. Just a terse message sent to 12 key people at 5:47 a.m. Conference room. 42nd floor. 6 o'clock. Attendance is mandatory. Deborah arrived at 5:55, her coffee untouched, her nerves wound tight. The same room where this had all started. Same floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a Manhattan skyline still dark with pre-dawn shadows. Same long table, now polished to a mirror shine. But everything felt different. Marcus Hayes sat near the head of the table, his expression guarded. 3 senior analysts flanked him, none of them making eye contact with anyone else. 2 enforcers stood by the door, silent, stone-faced, hands clasped in front of them. And at the far end of the table, looking calm and composed in an expensive navy suit, sat Victor Kane. He smiled when Deborah walked in. "Morning, Deborah," he said pleasantly. "Didn't expect to see you at a leadership meeting." Deborah didn't respond. She took a seat 3 chairs down from Victor, her laptop closed in front of her, her hands folded. Juan entered at exactly 6 a.m. Everyone stood. He waved them down with one hand and moved to the head of the table, placing a thin manila folder in front of him. He didn't open it. Just let it sit there like a promise. "Thank you for coming," Juan said, his voice calm and measured. "This won't take long." He looked around the table slowly, his gaze lingering on each person for a beat too long. 3 weeks ago, we discovered a financial leak. Millions disappearing through fake vendor accounts, disguised as operational costs. Ms. Burnside identified it. We closed it. And for a brief moment, I thought the problem was solved. Victor shifted slightly in his seat, his smile fading by a fraction. Juan continued. But then something interesting happened. Ms. Burnside's work started being undermined. Audit files were altered. Her access was revoked. Her apartment was surveilled. Someone wanted her discredited. Or worse. The room was completely silent. Juan opened the folder. So I did what I always do when people try to hide things from me. I watched. I waited. And I traced every thread back to the source. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the table toward Victor. "Explain this." Victor's expression didn't change. He picked up the paper, glanced at it, and set it back down. "I don't know what you want me to say, Juan. It's a transaction log. It's a record of every access point into our internal audit system over the past 6 months, Juan corrected. And your credentials appear 47 times. Always after hours. Always on files related to financial oversight." Victor's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed smooth. "I'm the logistics overseer. I review financials regularly. That's my job. Except," Juan said quietly, "you don't have authorization to edit audit files. Only to view them." He pulled out another document. "This is a timestamp log showing every edit made to the files Ms. Burnside flagged as tampered. All made from your workstation. All made within hours of her submitting her reports." Victor's smile was gone now. "That's circumstantial. Anyone with access to my login could." "Your login requires biometric authentication," Juan interrupted. "Fingerprint and retinal scan. The only person who can access your account is you." He slid a third document across the table. "And this is the offshore account where the laundered funds were being routed. Opened 8 months ago. Controlled by a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under a name I didn't recognize. So I had it traced." Juan's eyes locked onto Victor's. "It's yours." The air in the room turned to ice. Victor stared at the documents in front of him, his hands flat on the table, his breathing controlled. "You can't prove that," he said finally, his voice low. "I already have," Juan replied. "The shell company's registration papers were filed with a law firm you used 3 years ago for a real estate purchase. Same attorney. Same mailing address. The account deposits align perfectly with the dates of the fake vendor charges. And the withdrawal patterns match your personal spending habits down to the day." He leaned forward slightly. "You weren't just stealing, Victor. You were sloppy. You thought you were too valuable to be suspected. And that made you careless." Victor's hands curled into fists, but he didn't move. Marcus Hayes spoke for the first time, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. You've been bleeding us for months. How much? 3.2 million, Juan answered, his tone flat. Give or take. One of the analysts gasped softly. Victor laughed. Sharp, bitter, hollow. You think I'm the only one? You think your precious empire is clean? Everyone here is taking something, Juan. I just had the balls to take more. No, Juan said quietly. You had the arrogance to think you wouldn't get caught. He closed the folder. You've been with me for 8 years. I trusted you. I gave you access. I paid you more than you'd make anywhere else. And you repaid that by stealing from me and trying to destroy the one person who exposed you. Victor's mask finally cracked. His voice turned venomous. She's a fucking janitor, Juan. A nobody who got lucky once and you treated her like she was some kind of savant. You humiliated your entire operation for her. She saw the truth, Juan said coldly. You hid it. That's the difference between intelligence and corruption. Victor stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. So what now? You kill me. Make an example out of me. Juan didn't stand. He just looked up at Victor with the kind of calm that was more terrifying than rage. No, he said. I'm not going to kill you. Victor's eyes narrowed. Then what? You're going to return every dollar. Tonight. Wire transfer. Full amount. If you're short by even a penny, I'll reconsider my mercy. Victor's face drained of color. And then you disappear. Not dead. Just gone. You leave the city. You leave the business. You start over somewhere I'll never hear your name again. If you do that, you get to live. Juan's voice dropped lower. But if I ever see you again, if you ever contact anyone in this organization, if you ever speak my name, I won't give you a second chance. The room was silent except for the hum of the ventilation system. Victor stared at Juan for a long moment, his jaw working, his fists trembling. Then he nodded once. Fine. Good, Juan said. You have until midnight. After that, the offer expires. Victor turned and walked toward the door. The enforcers stepped aside, letting him pass. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No one spoke. Juan stood slowly, his hands resting on the table. Let me be very clear, he said, his voice carrying across the room like a verdict. If anyone else here is running side operations, skimming funds, or lying to me about anything, you have 72 hours to come clean. After that, I won't be this generous. He looked at Marcus. Audit every account, every vendor, every transaction. I want a full report by Friday. Marcus nodded, his face pale. Yes, sir. Juan turned to Deborah. Stay. The others filed out in silence, their footsteps hurried, their faces ashen. Within 2 minutes, the room was empty except for Juan and Deborah. Juan walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the city as the first light of dawn began to bleed across the skyline. You were right, he said quietly. The real danger wasn't the theft. It was the people who were threatened by you seeing it. Deborah stood slowly, her legs unsteady. Is it over? For now. Juan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. Victor will transfer the money. He'll disappear. The leak is closed. And what about me? Juan studied her for a long moment. You proved something tonight. Not just to me. To everyone in this room. You don't just see patterns, Deborah. You see the truth even when everyone around you is too scared or too corrupt to admit it exists. He stepped closer. So let me ask you something. Deborah's pulse quickened. What? Juan's gaze was sharp, unflinching, and impossibly direct. What do you see now? Deborah stood in the center of the 42nd floor conference room, the same room where this had all begun, and tried to find the words for what she was feeling. Fear, relief, exhaustion, power, all of it tangled together in a knot she couldn't untie. What do you see now? Juan's question hung in the air between them, simple and impossible at the same time. Deborah looked at him, really looked at him. Not as the man who could destroy her with a word, but as the man who'd trusted her when no one else would. Who'd protected her when she became a target. Who'd dismantled an 8-year relationship because the truth mattered more than loyalty built on lies. I see. She started, then stopped. I see that I can't go back. Juan nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. No, you can't. He walked to the window, the same place he'd stood weeks ago when 30 specialists had failed and she'd solved what they couldn't. The Manhattan skyline stretched out before them, the city waking up in layers of light and shadow. I've been thinking about something you said, Juan continued, his voice quieter now. The night I told you the cost of intelligence in my world. You asked me if you'd disappear if you were wrong. I remember. I told you only if you lied. He turned to face her. But that's not entirely true. Deborah's chest tightened. What do you mean? I told you that because I needed to know if you were someone who could handle honesty. Most people can't. They want reassurance. They want guarantees. They want to be told everything will be fine. His gaze was steady, unflinching. But you didn't. You asked the hard question and you accepted the hard answer. That's when I knew. Knew what? That you might be the only person I could trust to tell me the truth when it costs something. Deborah walked slowly to the table and sat down in the same chair where she'd explained the laundering scheme that first night. The leather felt different now. Not foreign, but familiar. Like it had been waiting for her all along. I spent 20 years being invisible, she said quietly. Cleaning floors. Watching people make decisions. Noticing things no one else saw and keeping my mouth shut because that's what survival looked like. She looked up at Juan. And then I walked into this room and everything changed. Not because I was special. Because I finally stopped pretending I didn't see what was right in front of me. Juan pulled out the chair at the head of the table. His chair, and sat down. For the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look like a man who controlled everything. He looked like someone carrying weight he couldn't share. You want to know what I see when I look at you? He asked. Deborah nodded. I see someone who scares me. She blinked. What? You scare me, Deborah. Because you don't want power. You don't want money. You don't want protection. You just want the truth to matter. And that makes you the most dangerous person I've ever brought into my operation. He leaned forward slightly. People I can control with fear, I understand. People I can buy with money, I understand. But someone who just wants things to add up correctly? Someone who can't be threatened or bribed into looking the other way. He shook his head slowly. That's someone I can't predict. And in my world, unpredictability is either an asset or a threat. Which am I? Deborah asked. Juan was silent for a long moment. I don't know yet. The honesty of it landed like a punch. Not cruel. Just true. Deborah realized, sitting there in the pre-dawn light, that this was what Juan had been doing all along. Not testing her loyalty. Testing whether she could exist in his world without being corrupted by it. You told me once that you don't make offers, Deborah said slowly. So what is this? This is me telling you that you have a choice. A real one. Juan's voice was calm, measured, but there was something underneath it. Something almost vulnerable. You can stay. Permanently. Not as someone I'm protecting temporarily. As someone I trust to keep this empire from bleeding out through cracks no one else can see." He paused. "I'll pay you more than you've ever imagined. Give you access to everything. Make you untouchable. You'll never have to clean another floor. Never have to work 3 jobs. Never have to survive on the edges of other people's decisions." It sounded like everything she'd never dared to dream about. "Or," Deborah asked quietly, "or you walk away. Tonight. I'll set you up somewhere safe. New city. New identity if you want it. Enough money to live comfortably without ever having to look over your shoulder. You disappear, and this whole chapter of your life becomes something that happened to someone else." Juan's expression didn't change, but his voice softened just slightly. "I'll protect you either way. But if you stay, you're choosing this world. And there's no halfway. You're either in completely, or you're out forever." Deborah stood and walked to the window. The city was waking up now. Lights flickering on in apartments across the skyline. Cars beginning their slow crawl through streets that never truly slept. Somewhere down there, people were starting shifts at diners and hospitals and office buildings, living the life she used to live. She thought about her mother. The medical bills. The years of exhaustion. The quiet desperation of trying to stay afloat while the world pressed down. She thought about the community college classroom where Mr. Castellano had told her she had a gift. The moment she'd believed things could be different. She thought about the night she'd walked into this room with a mop and accidentally proven that intelligence didn't need permission. "Can I ask you something?" Deborah said without turning around. "Yes. Why does it matter to you whether I stay or go? You've built an empire without me. You'll keep building it after me. So why give me this choice at all?" Juan was quiet for so long she almost thought he wouldn't answer. "Because I'm tired," he said finally. Deborah turned to look at him. Juan's face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not weakness. Weariness. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only tell me what they think I want to hear. Who smile and lie and scheme because they're too afraid to do anything else. I've built an empire on fear and control and the certainty that everyone has a price." He stood slowly. "And then you walked in. And you didn't lie. You didn't scheme. You just told the truth because you couldn't help yourself. And for the first time in years, I realized something." "What?" "That maybe the most valuable thing in this empire isn't loyalty or fear or power. It's someone who'll tell me the truth even when it costs them everything." He stepped closer. "So I'm asking you to stay. Not because I need another employee. Because I need someone I can trust when everyone else is lying. And I think you might be the only person alive who can do that." Deborah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Not from sadness. From the weight of finally being seen. Not as invisible. Not as less than. But as someone whose clarity was worth more than expertise, credentials, or pedigree. "If I stay," she said slowly, "I need you to promise me something. I don't make." "I know," Deborah interrupted. "But you'll make this one." Juan's jaw tightened. "What do you want?" "If I ever become like them, if I ever start lying to you or hiding things or letting fear make me quiet, you tell me. You don't let me rot from the inside out. You tell me, and you let me leave with my integrity intact." Juan stared at her. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Deal." Deborah walked back to the table and sat down. Not in the chair 3 seats away. Not in the chair by the door. In the chair directly to Juan's right. "I'm staying," she said quietly. "But not because you offered me money or power or safety." "Then why?" Deborah looked at him, her voice steady and clear. "Because for the first time in my life, Someone is asking me to stay exactly as I am. Not smaller. Not quieter. Just clear. Juan's expression softened. Just barely, just enough. Then welcome to the Empire, Ms. Burnside. They sat there in silence as the sun finally crested the horizon, spilling gold across the Manhattan skyline. The same view. The same room. The same table. But everything had shifted. The woman who'd walked into this room with a mop and a habit of noticing patterns had become the woman sitting at the table where empires were built and broken. And Juan Chappelle, the most feared man on the East Coast, the king who trusted no one, sat beside someone he might actually trust. Not because she was brilliant. Not because she was loyal. Because she was honest. And in a world built on lies, that made her the most dangerous weapon in the room. 3 months later, Deborah stood in the same conference room presenting quarterly projections to the senior leadership team. Marcus Hayes sat 2 seats down, his respect earned through results. The specialists who'd once dismissed her now deferred to her analysis without question. Juan sat at the head of the table, listening, watching, trusting. After the meeting ended and the others filed out, Juan stayed behind. "What do you see now?" he asked. The same question he'd asked that morning after Victor's fall. Deborah smiled slightly, looking out at the city that had once seemed impossibly far away. "I see an empire that's learning to value clarity over credentials, truth over complexity. And I see the most dangerous thing in this room." Juan raised an eyebrow. "Which is?" Deborah turned to face him, her voice quiet but certain. "It was never you, Juan. It was never power or fear or control." She picked up her laptop and headed for the door. "The most dangerous thing in the room was always clarity. And now you've got someone who won't let you forget it." Juan watched her leave, and for the first time in years he smiled. Not because he'd won. Because he'd finally found someone worth trusting. And in his world, that was rarer than power. It was everything. Thanks for watching till the very end. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be dropping another unforgettable story tomorrow, so make sure you don't miss it.